A man chased me when I was a kid. I was 9 or 10, and this is back in the early 90s when latchkey kids were fun and no one blinked an eye. I was home alone and decided to walk to my local Blockbuster, maybe a 30-minute there and back. I had done it before on my bike and wasn't worried or scared. I took off and got about halfway down my block when all the craziness started. Side note, unbeknownst to me, my neighbor's son was a drunk or drug addict or something was wrong with him. My parents evidently knew, but didn't tell me because he has moved out a while back, I guess. All of a sudden here comes a cherry picker roaring down the street, going super fast. I remember because several other cars passed, and this one made me jump and look up. There was a man shirtless in the top of the cherry picker hollering stuff like woo-hoo ye and your basic drunken BS. I immediately felt uncomfortable, and before I could decide what I wanted to do he saw me. He yelled something out at me and threw a beer bottle out. That freaked me out, and I immediately decided this trip was over and I was going home. I turned around and started back towards my house, but nervously decided to start heading into people's yards to make it look like I was going into a house. That didn't help at all. He was already heading towards me. The driver was now slapping his hand on the truck door, obviously drunk as well. They were yelling out to me with garbage, like, "Hey little girl, where are you going?" I ducked behind a house and saw a large pine tree between the 2 yards, so I jetted out and ducked behind it to see if they were still following me. To my absolute terror, the guy in the bucket goes, "I see you hiding behind that tree, little girl." At that point I lost it. I ran as fast as I could in a sheer panic to my house backyard and ran in, locking it behind me. I ran and checked the other locks and went into my parents' master bathroom and crawled into their shower and put a towel over me. I was sobbing, called my mom and dad, who told me to hang up and call 911. I did, and they asked me if I was hidden, which was so terrifying. Nothing happened after that. The cops arrived right after my parents pulled in and acted like they had been home IRL, but they are good peeps lol. The cops actually found the men and they were arrested and charged with my stuff and several other things they had evidently been up to that day. I wasn't the only one they harassed in our neighborhood, but I was the only child. And of course, it was our neighbor's drunk and disorderly son. So yeah, bad neighbor's creepy son, I'm sure you're in prison by now, but let's never meet. Armed home invaders. I'm a security guard for an alarm response company. We answer alarms for businesses and private residences. 99% of the time it's a motion detector set off by a cat, or a restaurant forgot to disarm their stuff before the stock truck arrived to unload. In this case, I was called out to a house where the back door alarm was set off, like it thought someone opened it. The owner was out of town, but she was alerted by her app and had her mother meet me there. We check the door, it's locked. We figure maybe someone tried the door, but it didn't budge, setting off the alarm. But there's a light on inside. The mom mentions this to daughter on the phone. Daughter says she isn't sure if she left the light on or not. It's a good idea to make people think someone's home, but she just isn't sure. That gave me a bad tingle. The mother wanted to go inside to check. However, she didn't have a spare key. The neighbor did, but they were asleep and mom didn't want to wake them. So, I fill out my papers and go back to my normal patrol routes. An hour later, the same home sends an alert out. I'm the only one in my city zone, so I answer it again. When I pull up, police and CSI are there talking to the mother and the now awake neighbor. They are reviewing video footage sent to them by the daughter. I look at the footage. 4 armed men wearing masks and hoodies came out of the bathroom a minute after the mother and I left. They proceeded to rob the place. They had broken in and locked the door behind them for appearances. They're the ones who turned on the light. The mother told me 3 guys had robbed her daughter's home a month before. Somehow, they knew when this girl would be out of town. They appeared smart, desiring a quiet robbery without conflict. But they brought guns, so they were prepared to shoot their way out of trouble if need be. The mother had wanted to go in. If she'd had a key, or woken the neighbor for the key, we would likely have been shot dead by these guys. When we went inside, work doesn't give me Kevlar vests or anything. If I ever get another house call and someone is there, I'm not going inside, no matter what is asked of me. I count myself fortunate the way was blocked this time, because I was prepared to foolishly go in and check if I could. The 1% of the calls where something is actually off, it has never been as bad as this one. To the armed robbers, let's not meet. Dunkin' Donuts terrorist. Got some D&D this morning, and it brought this story back to mind. Figured I'd share it here. During high school and college, I worked at Dunkin' Donuts for about 7 years and bounced around to a few different locations. I was used to working at the D&D in my town, where we would get the yeast rings delivered periodically and frost them ourselves as needed. I transferred to a new shop about a half hour from my house with all the same responsibilities except for the donuts. They were delivered by corporate, and they arrived frosted almost perfectly. They looked like the plastic donuts they show in commercials, always round and not squished together, and they would dip them in frosting, so it was evenly spread and neat. It was a busy Saturday morning, and was close to Valentine's Day, so we had a fresh order of brownie batter donuts delivered that morning. We were slammed, which was normal for a weekend, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to see my manager, who I'll call Jeremy, running around stressed out. When he first ran past me, I didn't think anything of it, and I continued making sandwiches at the sandwich station. He rushed by carrying a pastry tray, and I watched him begin frantically throwing something in the trash, looking worried as hell. At first I laughed and just said, "Jeremy, what the heck are you doing?" He straightened out and looked absolutely beside himself. I had never seen Jeremy look so lost, so I asked what was going on and if something was wrong. Someone filled the brownie batter donuts with staples. He told me he got a phone call from corporate that one of the stores in our chain, which contained 10, had somehow discovered multiple staples in every donut in their order. That was at least 48 donuts for our store and more/less for the other 9, depending on their sales. They told Jeremy we had to get rid of the most recent delivery because whoever put the batter in the filler dumped a ton of staples in it as well. Thankfully we hadn't sold all of the previous order yet from that morning, because it was still relatively early, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was going to be sick. What if a young child had gotten one of them? I pictured some family sitting at home on a Saturday morning, going out to get some drinks and donuts for the kids, and imagined everything else that could have happened after. I never found out what came of it, and as far as I know, neither did my boss. I'm assuming nothing happened, because I thankfully never heard anything on the news. Makes me wonder if they covered it up, and I hope they were able to find out who the asshole was who did it. So Dunkin' Donuts terrorist, let's not meet, and I hope somehow you're rotting away somewhere. Hi all. Bit freaked out, so I'll just get right into it. One Wednesday night in November at around 10:30 I heard a knock on my front door. I was upstairs at the time and I wasn't entirely sure I'd actually heard it, as I don't get too many visitors at that time, especially on a weekday. I live on a fairly busy street, but it usually quietens down around 7:30 p.m. and very few people other than neighbors come and go after that. Anyway, I decided it wasn't likely and that I'd imagined it, and I went downstairs, made a cuppa, and forgot about it for half an hour. For some reason it popped back into my head, and I decided to check the Ring doorbell app to see if the doorbell had caught anything, not really expecting to find much, so it took me by surprise when I saw a stranger in a yellow high-vis jacket and a beanie hat standing at my front door just half an hour before. I watched the video. It captures the few steps he takes before he stood directly in front of my house. He looks up at my bedroom, and then he takes a step back into the road. My front door opens directly onto the footpath, and there's a road after that. Now, I can't tell if he takes the step back in order to see my bedroom better, or if it's because a car had just turned onto my road and he wanted to position himself between two parked cars to make it more difficult for anyone to see him. Whatever it was, he definitely seemed to be aware of the car. When the car is out of sight, he steps forward and knocks on my door. People do this a lot despite me having a doorbell, and the moment he knocks he starts to act even weirder. He rubs his head, he's looking left to right and then up at my window, and then left to right and up at my window again. He sighs as though he's exasperated, and then something to the right catches his eye and he very swiftly power walks off in the opposite direction that he came from. Moments later I hear my neighbor's front door open, and I realize that this strange man has seen the neighbor walking toward his door through the privacy glass and decided he didn't want that confrontation. I live in a terraced house and it's easy for neighbors to get confused by whose door is being knocked on. I call for my partner to watch the video, and he also has never seen this man before, but agrees that he looks really dodgy. I send the video to two of my brothers who also agree he looks shifty as hell, and advise me to call the police if he comes back, and to then call them right away. Now, we live in a high crime area and we've all seen our share of drama and trauma, and we are all detecting something off about this man. It's not just a case of paranoia. Anyway, I decided to check previous captures by my doorbell and I see this guy walk past my house 4 nights in a row. Just walk right past and that's it. The last and 5th time he's caught was the incident I just described, and he's never seen again. So, last night about 11 PM I'm in my backyard emptying my indoor recycling bin into the outdoor one, when I suddenly get an odd sensation, and look to my left to see what looks like the shape of a man standing at the far end of my alleyway. In some English terraced houses, 2 houses will share a long alley that is sandwiched between them and sort of built into the brickwork. They're really dark even in the daylight and most people will agree, quite scary. Mine and my neighbor's back gardens can be accessed through our alley, and it leads right out onto the street. Now, my alley has a large gate that I try to keep locked at all times, but I have noticed someone had been only putting the latch on and not locking it with the key. Anyway, back to the shape. I don't have the best eyesight, and so for a moment I think my mind is playing tricks on me. It was like there was a vague man shape that was darker than the surrounding dark, and so I'm looking at it trying to convince myself that my mind is playing tricks on me when suddenly my heart is in my fucking throat, because I hear frantic footsteps coming from the direction of the shape and I suddenly lose sight of the head. Or where I thought the head was, like it had suddenly ducked down or something. I literally flew into my house and locked the door. I stand in my kitchen looking out of the window not knowing what to expect when I realize my partner is in his shed doing woodwork. So I text him someone is in the alley and to stay put, and he takes from that run into the garden welding a hammer, so that's what he did. This fucking creep would have had plenty of time to realize what was going on as my garden is long, and so he took off. My partner confirmed the gate had been messed with and opened. I'm just wondering if the two things are linked and what everyone's thoughts are. I have the video, but I live right across from small business with its name in huge letters, and so for privacy reasons I'd rather not upload it. Something happened in the delivery room that the nurses and I will never talk about. Don't be afraid, Madeline. I'll be right here with you every single step of the way, okay? I assured her while squeezing her nervously shaking hand. Yeah, she whispered while nodding and squeezing my hand in return. She turned her head to look at me. And thank you doc, for everything, she said while beaming with a smile. Madeline had all the right in the world to be nervous. After all, this was her first pregnancy at the relatively young age of 23. She'd informed me the father had fled after discovering her pregnancy, and her parents apparently lived too far away to attend today. That left her alone at the hospital, with nobody to support her except for me, and I would do everything I could to make sure she felt comfortable. At that moment we were on our way to the labor and delivery room, and I trundled her along in the wheelchair she'd been prescribed. She wasn't in a state to walk considering she was already going into labor. Once we arrived into the room, the 2 other nurses present helped Madeline settle into the birthing bed. We measured Madeline's vitals such as her blood pressure and heart rate with the necessary medical equipment. Then we hooked up the fetal monitor to her belly to measure the contractions, and best of all, the baby's heartbeat. Despite her labored breathing, Madeline smiled at the reassuring sound of the steady drumming of the heartbeat. After a few minutes I assessed whether her cervix had dilated adequately, then gave the thumbs up to the other nurses. She was ready to push. It's time, I nodded across to Madeline. Only about 20 minutes later, after bouts of pushing, the baby's head had finally peeked through, though it wasn't completely out yet. The baby's crowning, I communicated to the nurses. Finally, after one more push, the head popped out onto the bed. I blinked, dumbfounded at the sight of the tiny head detached from the rest of the body. It rolled around for a few seconds on the bedsheet before coming to a standstill. The rest of the nurses blankly stared at the baby's head too, silent and still as they watched. The head appeared to be severed halfway at the neck, and blood dripped from where it had been decapitated. The baby's eyes were open and unblinking, glassy orbs that were devoid of life. My gut churned at the sight, and I had to suppress the overpowering urge to vomit. Unfortunately, one of the other nurses couldn't stomach it like I did. I watched as one nurse, Larissa, hurried over to the edge of the room, bent over the trash bin, and spewed out whatever lunch she'd tried to keep down. The other nurse, Thomas, had his mouth cupped in his hands, and his saucer-sized eyes were wide open in shock. I imagined I didn't look too different from Thomas. My jaw hung limply open, and my eyes were fixated on the ghastly sight of the baby's head. I was interrupted from my stupor by Madeline's voice. What happened? Is the baby alright? Madeline was confused, which meant she hadn't yet seen what happened. My assumption was she was too weak to lift her body up, to look at the baby's head at her feet. For now she was oblivious to the horror the rest of us witnessed. I fumbled for words to explain to her but failed, so I decided that the best way was to just show her. With trembling hands I picked up the baby's head. Thankfully I wore rubber gloves and inched closer to Madeline. With each step, blood dripped like viscous goo from the baby's neck onto the floor. Finally I reached a position where Madeline could properly view what hid in my cupped hands. At first there was simply silence. Madeline stared blankly at the lifeless eyes of the baby for a few seconds, as if unsure of what to make of the sight. Then something within her snapped. Her mouth stretched taut, and she summoned the most haunting, shrill scream from the depths of her lungs. I never knew a human was capable of making such a harrowing sound. I even had to drop the head to cover my ears, though that wasn't enough to shut the noise out. I don't know how long the screaming lasted for, a couple of seconds, or maybe an eternity. Suddenly she stopped, and it was dead quiet. My eyes darted toward Madeline, who now sat motionless in bed, her arms hanging limp by her sides. Slowly, her eyes began to shut, her head lolled to the side, and finally her body collapsed in a heap onto the bed. She'd fainted. I bolted to her side and began furiously tapping her face, but she was unresponsive. Madeline was like a candle that had been snuffed out, and I didn't know how to revive her. I tried to rack my brain for a solution to her state. Surely something I knew in all my years of being a doctor could be of help. But my stunned brain had nothing. Just as if things couldn't get worse, I heard Thomas's trembling voice call me in a frail whisper. "D-Doc." I turned to face him. His eyes were nearly bulging out of his sockets as he stared at something I couldn't see by Madeline's feet, around where the head had been. He didn't speak, he just pointed at it with a wavering arm. I rounded the bed in order to see what he pointed at. A long spindly arm had appeared from the opening where the baby's head had popped out. It snaked across, clawing its fingernails along the bedsheet until its head soon popped out. Then the rest of its small body came tumbling out. It lay unmoving on the sheet, encased within a wet web of amniotic fluid. The first thought that struck me to explain what it could be was that it was another baby. But as I cautiously stepped closer to peer at the body, I realized whatever it was couldn't have been a baby. Or maybe it was a baby once upon a time. It looked more like an abomination. Its clammy skin was a sickly shade of yellow with patches of white, like curdled milk. Its veiny head was far too large for its body, and it struggled to balance on its thin neck that I felt like I could easily snap at any moment. Its ribs visibly poked out of the skin that stretched over it, as if it was malnourished. Spindly arms and legs jutted out, and they seemed disproportionately long for its body. At first I thought it was dead, but then I saw its jaws open, revealing a row of jagged, bony teeth. I stepped back a bit for my safety, wondering what the creature would try to do. I was taken aback when a few seconds later the thing let out a raspy cry just like every other innocent baby which first emerges into the world does. Usually when a baby cries you are meant to hold it, but I had no clue what to do to the thing to make it calm down and shut up. I felt dumbstruck, and for one of the few times in my career as a doctor, I truly didn't know what to do. With no other options left, I realized what I had to do. I decided to make an important phone call to my boss. "Sit tight. Do not leave the room. I'll take care of it." Those were the last words of the hospital CEO himself. I'd spilled out the entire story to him, not sparing any detail. At first he asked if I was joking when I spoke of the decapitated head and the creature that had crawled out from Madeline's womb, but he realized I wasn't kidding when he sensed the far too real fear and dread in my voice, and he decided to help us. And help us he did. The nurses and I sat for more than 2 hours within that room, enduring the cries of the thing on the bed. After the torturous wait I heard the door creaking open and a figure dressed in a blue hazmat suit stepped through. About 5 similarly dressed figures followed into the room. I spotted another figure standing by the doorway who hadn't walked inside yet. He wasn't wearing a hazmat suit, just a sleek, tailored, black suit. His beard was cleanly shaven, and his salt and pepper hair was slicked back. He exuded a familiar aura of confidence and power. I sighed in relief when I realized it was the boss, Dr. Richard Farley. He waltzed into the room and surveyed the scene, drinking in the image of the decapitated head on the floor, the creature crying on the birthing bed, and Madeline who'd fainted. He saw with his very own eyes the traumatizing sight the nurses and I witnessed. If there was any ounce of doubt before about my story, he certainly believed us now. Finally the boss decided to address us. After examining the scene, I've brought in a team of experts to contain this situation. They will inspect the site and clean up the mess. Considering the unknown nature of this creature, this area will be treated as a biohazardous zone that is possibly contaminated, so they will sterilize every inch of this room until it's spotless. It will be like all of this never happened, he said with a grin that was meant to be reassuring. And that was that. The boss then ordered the nurses and I to go home and pretend that this never happened. He said that talking about the incident might lead other unwanted ears to hear the story and possibly leak it to the press, which would not be good for the hospital's reputation. Such an incident would have been bad publicity, he said. So he swept it under the carpet. To keep us quiet he threatened that he would pin the death of the baby on us if we ever leaked the story to the press or anybody else. But even though he forced us to forget what happened, I wanted answers and closure about that day. I wanted an explanation of the severed head and the origins of that creature, so I pestered my boss into telling me everything. Apparently a private lab had run DNA tests of that barely human creature that Madeline had birthed. It had a match to Madeline's DNA, which meant she was the biological mother. However, in some places the DNA had mutated, with disastrous consequences. For now it's speculation, but the source of mutation could be some unknown drug, radiation, or a toxin which infected the baby. Whatever the cause, it led to that mutant-looking baby's existence. It had managed to live throughout most of Madeline's pregnancy as a parasite, but it didn't feed on its mom. It gained its sustenance from its twin brother. That explained the decapitated head. It ate the rest of its brother. I asked Dr. Farley what they did to the baby. He told me they took care of it. I understood the hidden meaning being that they disposed of it after doing all the necessary tests with the specimen. Then I asked Dr. Farley what happened to Madeline. He told me she was admitted into a psychiatric ward because she couldn't cope with the stress of losing her child like that. He was kind at least to give me the address of the institution. I went to visit Madeline the next day and saw she was a hollow shell of her former self. When I walked into her room she didn't even acknowledge my existence. She was silent, like she'd forgotten how to speak. She didn't move once from her bed. In her baggy dark eyes I could see she was dead inside. Something within Madeline snapped that day in the delivery room, and her mind wasn't ready to mend itself. After being irreparably broken, I couldn't live like this without being able to talk about what happened. And honestly, fuck my boss, because I don't care if he sees what I've written here and punishes me for it. I just can't suppress the experiences of that day. I just need someone out there to listen to my story. Anyone. So you've made it to the end of the video. What a chat. Like and subscribe for more Reddit content. Click the playlist to go further down the rabbit hole, and see you in the next video.